Hello and welcome back to the Dungeon Podcast, brought to you by Anti-Fragile Fitness. Today I'm flying solo as Jake and Andrew are doing quite a bit of work on the back end for Anti-Fragile Fitness. We had a number of topics that we're sort of sifting through, presenting. We have isometrics, plyometrics, micronutrients. We wanted to start with something that's a cornerstone of Anti-Fragile Fitness, that is the transverse plane. For those of you who don't know what that means, there's three planes of motion for exercise. There's the front to back, the side to side, and the rotational plane. Now, when you're going into a commercial gym, you're going to see a lot of people who are training the front to back plane, and really they're just training forwards. You're seeing a lot of people doing presses, predominantly the bench press. You'll see people squatting. You'll see people training the posterior chain and anterior chain in one direction. When you see weighted carries like a farmer's walk, they're still typically going in one direction. They're very rarely going backwards. They're very rarely going side to side. You'll see side to side a bit more for anyone who comes from a high school football background. That's about it. Anyone who plays a team sport, they'll train side to side, but it will leave that praxis for that sport as they leave the sport. Now, what's the rotational plane? Well, it's pretty simple. It's how effectively your body can rotate. Exercises that involve rotation in real life are actually endless. When you see a baby crawl, there's a bit of rotation in the trunk. When you see a man effectively sprint, you'll see a bit of rotation in the trunk. When you see someone hit a baseball, when you see someone hit a golf ball, when you see someone carry a large cumbersome object up the stairs, you're going to see rotation of the trunk, rotation of the body. Now, these are the kinds of things that are often regarded with quite a bit of caution or immense fear, even. Now, you'll see a lot of people who are out of shape. They'll beware carrying large cumbersome objects by themselves because they're afraid that if they sort of twist their body, they're going to get injured. And if they don't train their rotational plane, they're actually right. There's a great quote by a man named Pat McNamara. Pat McNamara was in the Special Forces community. It is believed that he was in Delta Force. He can neither confirm nor deny. And he was known in the Special Forces community for being someone who would provide the workouts after practice for marksmanship. And he talks about the three planes of motion. He's one of the many, quote unquote badasses to go on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. And he talked about how if you're just training front to back, it should be one of two things. You should be a professional bodybuilder, that's your JOB. Training in isolation, it should be predominantly for rehabilitation. Or you just plain don't know what you're doing. Now, I tend to agree. Joe Rogan interjected and said, or you're just trying to look fucking sexy, quote unquote. But he really emphasized the rotational plane as an essential modality of training, an essential goal for training, that is. He labeled the transverse / rotational plane where life-saving and ass-kicking lives. And it's true. What does he mean by that? If you're going to carry a body out of a ditch, a wounded warrior, you're going to need some strength in the rotational plane. If you're doing that body drag, you have one step backwards, another step backwards, another step backwards, as you're sort of shuffling with the body in front of you. That's a rotation of the trunk. That's why they train with the dummy drag carries and many formats of basic training. So that's life-saving. If you're a firefighter and you're swinging an axe against wood, that's rotational. That's life-saving. Now, if we're talking ass kicking, this is even simpler. If you're a Muay Thai fighter, it is very clear that you need to turn with your kicks. Now, any of you listening to this who come from a background of Kyokushin karate or Taekwondo, you might interject about the kicks being a snapping kick, but you're still rotating the hips. This is a much easier example when it comes to rotation. Um, if we stay in a more specific kind of striking, boxing, if you break down the mechanics of throwing a punch, you're going to see a rotation of the feet to build the kinetic chain, to exert force through the knuckles, from the feet to the knuckles. So you're going to see a turning of the feet and a turning of the hips, a turning of the torso, even for straight punches, not just hook punches. Rotational plane once again. Let's take a look at your grapplers. Just look at any awkward position in wrestling, and you'll see a turning both side to side and rotationally of the trunk to gain a dominant position. And the same thing goes with jiu-jitsu. What's one of the first things you do in jiu-jitsu warm-ups? The shrimp, rotational plane. So if you are not training your rotational plane, you are plain and simple fragile. You are not capable of life-saving. You are not capable of ass-kicking. It's just the way it is. Now, if one trains on a max and dynamic effort standpoint for the rotational plane, when he goes into the real world, he'll be able to more effectively hit a softball at the company softball game this spring. He'll be able to more effectively carry someone out of a burning building. He'll be able to defend himself, defend others. So the rotational plane should be treated as a main focus of training in any training program that goes beyond aesthetics, that goes beyond a powerlifting program where you're just trying to get good at the press, the deadlift, and the squat. Now, what do I say the press instead of the bench press? Well, if you break down what the core movements of the human body in a max effort standpoint before you get into more specific movements of dynamic effort, you're going to see 9 core movements. You have the press, that's the most common. Within the press, you have the vertical and you have the horizontal press. Most commonly, the bench press. And in terms of training an athlete or a first responder, this is probably the least important, although it is treated like the most important. You have the deadlift, or the hinge, if you want to simplify it a bit more. You have the squat. You have the weighted carry, immensely important. You have the full body explosive movement. You have the anterior chain movement, single limb movement, and you have the rotational movement. Now, what are some movements that can be trained? That can be trained in a max effort standpoint in order to develop the rotational movement. Now, many of you, if you walk into any commercial gym, you'll see kind of universal cables. There may be some odd platform for people to do box jumps on. You'll see those in most Gold's gyms, especially in California. And you'll see somewhere to do T-bar rows. You'll see a little slot to stick one end of a barbell in. You'll see a number of ways you can do a landmine exercise. Right? Landmine is a pretty standard, somewhat commonly known way to train the rotational plane. While I've been somewhat critical of cable machines, and anyone in anti-fragile fitness knows that I tend to steer clear of cable machines for the most part, with a few exceptions. The half kneeling cable chop is an excellent way of building a rotational plane. There are just better ways. Now, if you take a look at the programs of old-time strongmen, you'll see a number of movements that have been forgotten for many reasons. This predates the craze of bodybuilding that was actually pioneered by the likes of Arthur Saxon and Eugene Sando. Before this, strength was king. It wasn't bodybuilding. And in the East, it remained strength, and bodybuilding was a secondary thing. And over time, thanks to the ambitions of Americans and Germans in the realm of sports science, and the popularity of Arthur Saxon and Eugene Sando, down the line, we had Mr. Olympia competition, the first winner being Larry Scott, followed by Sergio Oliva, and then, of course, the superstar, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Whether you love him or hate him, he's the reason why bodybuilding is so popular now. And he's the reason why we see more and more exercises being done in isolation, why the Nautilus machine became king for a while and is still very much finding itself in the programs today, why cables are so important, why dumbbells are emphasized less than the kettlebell and the barbell. Now, a lot of these movements of old time strongman were actually used to build a strength base in which to create a greater capacity for stress stimulus on the muscles for hypertrophy. They were also known to have less available racks in which to do exercises off of. So you saw all sorts of ways in which the barbell could be picked up in order to do their exercises. You had a very strong posterior chain in many directions. You saw a strong posterior chain, a strong back side to side. You saw it be very strong, even with curvature. A very flexible and dynamic thoracic spine. So on a front rack, you'd see plenty of people hang clean up the bars. There's a lift that I'm going to begin practicing called the Arthur lift, pioneered by none other than Arthur Saxon, where you sort of deadlift the bar behind the back, you hinge the back, and you slide the barbell all the way up to the back to the top position to begin your sets of behind the back overhead presses, or squats, or reverse lunges, or walking lunges, or what have you. There were other exercises as well using predominantly kettlebells and sometimes barbells. There's great pictures of George Hackenschmidt, Alan P. Mead, of them rotating in an exercise what is called the bent press, not bench press, but BENT, bent press. Now, this is known as the most difficult movement in the world of kettlebells. For those of you who are very much attuned to the barbell, you will know the snatch as the most primal, most difficult lift involving the barbell. It's one fluid, powerful movement to get the barbell overhead. It's not done in such a sequence as a clean and jerk. The bent press is the kettlebell equivalent of the barbell snatch, despite the fact that there is indeed a kettlebell snatch. The kettlebell snatch is actually quite a bit easier than the barbell snatch because kettlebells mold to the body. The body does not mold to the barbell. The body has to mold to the barbell. The barbell will never mold to the body. The bent press is as follows. You, from the bottom position on the floor, you clean the kettlebell to the front rack position. And then whichever side you're holding the kettlebell in the front rack, you're going to tilt the torso to the opposite side. And you're going to put the kettlebell on what's called a side rack, which is just over the shoulder. And from this position, you're going to lower and rotate the torso until the kettlebell is in the same vertical lane as the opposite leg. The press part of it is quite simply a misnomer. There's no point in which you're taking the arm and pressing the kettlebell. You're actually just getting under the kettlebell on the opposite side. The finishing position you will see in a full squat with the torso fully rotated, the kettlebell in line with the opposite leg. There is no instance in which the kettlebell should rise higher than the starting position. This is quite simply the best way to max out the rotational plane. If you begin to do this extensively, you'll have a very strong rotational plane that will translate to other exercises of modern and old-time strongman standards. You'll probably see the likes of Hathor Bjornsson, Brian Shaw, Eddie Hall, all of those modern strongmen of the like, performing an exercise called the Steinborn squat, where one has a barbell on the floor. He picks up one side of the barbell and puts the barbell vertically. And he sort of twists his torso with his legs still on the ground. And he puts himself on either bent to the right or bent to the left position in which to secure the barbell on his traps and grip the barbell and turn back to the opposite side to be with a fully erect barbell. Now, from a side-to-side standpoint, this is actually a bit of a hybrid movement between the side-to-side plane and the transverse plane. And while you can use quite a bit more weight than a bent press, this is not a purely rotational exercise. Although if you get good at the bent press, you'll quite simply be good at loading up for a Steinborn squat and vice versa, to be abundantly clear. Now, one will then ask, how does one perform a bent press? How does one work up to such a feat? Should I start with a small kettlebell? Should I start with a bigger kettlebell? Should I start with a barbell? I had a mentor out in Iowa who coached me online back in 2017 after I saw a video of him doing a 205-pound Byzantine get up with a barbell that I mentioned in the first episode of this podcast. And I was absolutely blown away that this is even possible. And I received some programming from him, and I told him I eventually wanted a bent press. And he said his prerequisite for a bent press is being able to do a 100-pound Byzantine get up. So to be clear, I think the easiest entry point for doing rotational exercises is in the family of landmines and half kneeling cable chops. If landmines are even too difficult for you, using the cables for half kneeling cable chop. Then moving up to landmines, then moving up to the Byzantine get up. Now, if you get the Byzantine get up programmed in the correct fashion, not just for endurance of doing reps for 10 minutes nonstop, which I also recommend, you will eventually rise like I did, to be abundantly honest. When I first did a Byzantine get up, I could barely do it with 5 pounds. My body was tremendously tight. I lacked the coordination. And I went to another coach who went in the Bay Area, Ivan Batnich, and he taught me how to perfect the get up and add additions to it, such as windmills, which are often mistaken for a bent press. Mastering the Turkish get up, which we call the Byzantine get up, we'll eventually see the weight rise significantly. If you have a gym that does kettlebells in pounds, 10-pound increments, that's probably best. If you're stuck with a gym that uses them in the more commonly deployed increments of 12 kg, 24 kg, 32 kg, so on and so forth, it'll take a little bit more time. But you'll still be able to rise to the point where you could begin to load up a barbell, and you'll have an easier time scaling after that. Once you reach a 100-pound get up, find someone, whether online or in person, to seek some coaching for a video session on on starting and perfecting the bent press. Now, one might ask if let's say you have no plans on being in a position to save someone's life. You're not planning on being a first responder, you're not planning on being a soldier, and you're not planning on doing martial arts. Well, I'd say that's a pretty sad life that you're not planning on ever doing martial arts, but to each his own, I suppose. You're probably going to ask, why is it that I would want to train my rotational plane? Well, it's just very simple. You are not going to be injury proof. Your body is going to be quite fragile. If you find yourself having to move boxes or helping someone move in, whether it's your son moving into his college dorm, you're just moving places, you don't have mover help, you're going to be very prone to injury because you're going to be walking upstairs, doing a weighted carry, shifting your weight in awkward positions, and you're probably going to tweak your very weak quadratus lamborum, which is a scientific term for the lower back. If you lack the core strength and particular contexts, you're going to injure your lower back and probably injure your thoracic spine on the way up, probably see some shoulder issues and some hip issues. So training the rotational plane isn't just for those who are trying to live intense, dangerous lives, who seek a higher call to run into danger, whether in the ring, the battlefield, the burning building, the crime scene, so on and so forth. It's for people who want to live a healthier life. In terms of expression, if you go back to about the 80s, you'll see, or maybe as late as the 90s, you'll see when people dance, you'll see a shift, a capacity to move the pelvis, to be more fluid. And while I did my time in drama school, um, we did at least, gosh, there were some days where we had 4 classes of movement, different kinds, whether it was dance, um, sort of improvisational, expressive movement. I don't want to get too out there on this podcast, but we were trying to see uh, in one lesson what made one person moving compelling and what made one person moving not so compelling. Now, someone did one movement of reaching out, very static, with the lower body cut off from the upper body. And we saw that it sort of fell flat. It was lazy. We saw someone involve the pelvis, rotating the pelvis, almost engaging their entire body with feeling. And we found it more compelling. We found that it was able to express the magnitude with which they were trying to present this thing, present this person who was about to speak, whether it was a king in a Shakespeare play or a Greek god in a play like any of the classics that you see in the Greek canon in the time of the amphitheater. You're going to interact with life better if you rotate. You're going to be able to dance better. You're going to be able to move better. You're going to be able to feel better. You're not going to feel like there's a part of you that's locked, that there's energy stowed away somewhere. It gets a bit ridiculous and almost hippie in saying that if you don't train rotationally, you're actually missing out on life. If you're not fully attuned with your body, you're not really fully attuned with who it is that you are. You're not living as humans were meant to live, pre-20th century. Now, there are plenty of reasons why one can sort of diagnose why people are so miserable today. Um, you can say there's a lack of meaning. That's true. You can say maybe capitalism's gotten out of hand. Maybe the political. You take your pick. Seed oils. There's always someone to blame, right? And while it's not necessarily a good mindset to have in terms of being a victim, and you don't want to become somewhat of a hypochondriac, trying to always figure out what's wrong with you mentally or what's wrong with you physically. If the entirety of human history was doing things one way and they were healthy, and then just over the course of 100 years they decide to deviate from that and find they're incredibly unhealthy, there's obviously a track record there. Many people are sort of hell-bent on approaching that scenario politically. But if we approach it in terms of our health, there have been many strides that have been made in the past 3 years since the onset of the lockdowns with COVID. Seed oils are becoming a mainstream issue now. Fake organic foods, the foods with the organic label that aren't indeed organic, are becoming a mainstream issue. Vaccinated cows, so on and so forth. Why not study the way the human body interacted with the world? Why I was happier, why I was healthier, why I was stronger. It's not just a rotational plane, but it's a wonderful place to start. If your rotational plane is trained, you're going to strengthen your hip flexors. You're going to strengthen your core. And if you strengthen your hip flexors, you have the capacity to lengthen. And if you have the capacity to lengthen, you will stretch the psoas. For those of you who don't know the psoas are your hip flexor muscles that start right in the groin, and they sort of connect internally to the upper body. They're actually the only muscle group that connect the upper and lower body. So if the psoas gets tight, you compress the gut. And if you compress the gut, you're going to compress something that actually has a direct effect on your mental health. Because we know for a fact now that gut health is tied to mental health. So if you're compressing that gut, you're compressing your mind. Strength cannot be divorced from health. That's a quote by the great George Hackenschmidt. And there are many, like I said before, there are 9 movements in which you need to strengthen. And if you strengthen them, then you'll be healthier. And if you're healthier, you'll most likely be happier. You'll feel more fulfilled, more grounded, more capable of approaching any situation that comes your way that may just involve life saving and ass kicking. Now, this is a short one today. Um, I want to, over time, get to about an hour, but having an hour of sports science talk can be a bit jarring for people who aren't sort of conditioned to it. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you don't think that training your rotational plane is a good idea after that, then I don't think anything ever will convince you, in which case you probably shouldn't be listening to this podcast. Anti-Fragile Fitness is expanding. We have 4 people on our staff now. Um, we're about to have 4 full-fledged coaches, and we have a number of new aspects of fitness that are being rolled out to add to our system. If you're in particular a first responder, a soldier, an aspiring fighter, a martial artist, a father who wants to regain his strength for the sake of himself and the sake of his family, we offer one-on-one coaching on a monthly fee. That also includes our weekly men's groups, sports science seminars, and many more things beyond that. So DM us on Instagram at anti.fragile.fitness. As always, God bless and happy training. Thank you.